All right, today we're diving into something, well, it's pretty wild. We're looking at a news segment that talked about a huge U.S. military operation in Venezuela. But here's the kicker. They discussed it as if it had already happened. So let's pull back the curtain and see exactly how they built this story. And right out of the gate, you hear this. We went in and got them. I mean, wow. It's so direct, so final, it just immediately frames the whole thing as this clean, successful mission. But you've got to ask, what exactly are they even talking about?
Okay, and this right here, this is the key to understanding everything else we're about to see. The entire segment, the whole conversation, was about a hypothetical scenario, a what if. But, and this is the crazy part, the panel talks about it like it's breaking news that just unfolded. So, with that in your mind, let's dig into how they actually constructed this whole narrative, starting with the so-called operation itself.
So, first things first, they get right into the nuts and bolts of the military action. And they don't just give you a vague outline. No, they paint this incredibly vivid picture of a mission that was just flawless, surgical even.
And look at how specific they get here. They're not just saying special forces, they're naming names. Delta, the 160th, the elite of the elite. The target? Super specific. President Maduro and his wife. The result? A success. They were removed. But honestly, the most crucial detail they drop is this one. There was barely any resistance. No real fight from Venezuelan or Cuban forces. And that one point right there becomes the bedrock for their entire argument. So how do you explain an operation going that smoothly? Well, according to the panel, it wasn't just a stroke of luck. They saw it as absolute proof of some serious prep work. As one guest put it, it showed a massive amount of preconditioning, all built on, quote, exquisite intel and insights. Basically, they're saying the groundwork was laid long before anyone went in. And this is where they make a huge leap. For them, the fact that nobody really fought back wasn't just a tactical detail, it was a political statement. They argued it was a clear sign that people inside Venezuela actually wanted this to happen, that they were willing to help. And this idea, this narrative of internal support, becomes a massive justification for the whole intervention to begin with.
All right, so if that's how it supposedly went down, the big question is why? Why would this happen? Well, the panel was ready with an answer. They connected the need for this kind of dramatic action to several major threats that they claimed were hitting the United States right at home.
And the case they built was, it had a lot of layers to it. First, the fentanyl crisis. They pinned that directly on Maduro, calling him the top drug kingpin in the world. Then, chaos at the border. They linked that to the spread of Venezuelan gangs. They also pointed to his meetings with China and Russia as a major geopolitical threat right in our hemisphere. And kind of tying it all together was this idea of U.S. credibility, that this was a chance to finally push back after years of what they saw as American weakness on the world stage.
And this quote, this really gets to the emotional heart of their argument. Hundreds of thousands of people have been dying from fentanyl. He's been targeting us. See how that's framed? This isn't some far-off foreign policy debate. They're presenting it as a direct, deadly attack on Americans. So in their story, this wasn't an invasion, it was self-defense.
Okay, so the operation is a success. Maduro is gone. Then what? What happens the day after? The panel didn't just leave it at that. They actually laid out a very clear vision for the transition of power that would come next.
And the plan they described was, well, it was incredibly hands-on. The U.S. would step in to provide key leadership. They'd bring in American oil companies to get the infrastructure back online. Then they'd get the remaining Venezuelan leaders to cooperate. All of this to manage a smooth handover to what they called a proper government.
Now, they were also really careful to put some boundaries on this. As one guest said, we're not going to go in and take over the country. That's not the idea. So the way they framed it, this wasn't some kind of permanent occupation. It was supposed to be a temporary, stabilizing force, just to help Venezuela get back on its feet.
But you have to see, this entire transition plan rested on one huge assumption. The panel basically argued that the Venezuelan officials left behind wouldn't just go along with it. They'd be pretty grateful for it, that they would see the U.S. as liberators, saving them from a regime that had completely destroyed their country.
But the story they're telling here doesn't just stop at Venezuela's borders. Oh no. The panel made it very clear that the real impact of this operation was meant to be much, much bigger. It was about sending a loud and clear message across the entire Western Hemisphere.
And they named names: Cuba, Colombia, Mexico. They were all specifically put on notice. This whole operation, in their telling, was a signal that the U.S. was back in the driver's seat in the region, and everybody else better take note.
And these weren't vague warnings either. They were tailor-made. For Cuba, which is so dependent on Venezuelan oil, the message was basically an economic threat to their survival. For Mexico, it was more like a direct order. You must figure out what you're doing about the cartels because our patience is gone.
And really, this quote just sums up the whole worldview perfectly. It's a new day, and we're willing to do what we should do, especially when it comes to our own hemisphere. It's basically a declaration, right? Announcing a new era of American assertiveness and making it clear the U.S. is ready to do what it takes to secure its interests right here in its own backyard.
So, let's step back for a second. When you put all these pieces together, the perfectly executed operation, the urgent reasons for it, the detailed transition plan, and this big global message, what's the full story that's really being told here?
When it comes down to it, this was never really just about one hypothetical mission in Venezuela. The entire segment was built to tell a much bigger story. A story about the return of decisive American power. The narrative is that the U.S. is stepping back into its role as the region's leader, ready to restore what they call democracy and responsible governments.
And this final quote from a guest just ties it all up with a bow. Latin America's turned the page, and I think we're going back to democracy and responsible governments. It's this very hopeful, forward-looking conclusion that suggests this one single, and remember, hypothetical, action could spark this wave of positive change across the whole continent.
And that really brings us to the heart of what we're looking at today. When you present a what-if scenario with all the certainty and detail of a real breaking news story, you create an incredibly powerful narrative. And it leaves us with a really important question to think about. What happens to our public conversation, to how we understand the world, when that line between a hypothetical idea and a real event gets, well, blurry? It's definitely something to chew on. Thanks for joining me.